We've had a couple of deaths recently. One lady was in the park, someone that we knew, a homeless person that died. And sometimes when those things happen, in some ways it just kind of galvanizes my, desire to make things different. And sometimes people might mistake, my passion for some of that as anger.
Connie Mitchell has spent her life serving those in need, especially those who often need the most help. Connie Mitchell, Executive Director of the Institute for Human Services, next on Long Story Short.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox is Hawaii's first weekly television program produced and broadcast in high definition.
Aloha mai kākou. I'm Leslie Wilcox. Connie Mitchell runs Hawaii's oldest and largest nonprofit agency dedicated to the problem of homelessness. But for all of her efforts, and she generally gets high marks for her work from a range of community stakeholders, Hawaii has one of the highest homeless rates in the nation. She's known for her positive attitude, in fact, a fiercely positive attitude despite challenges. And she's known for seeing the homeless population as people, as individuals. Born Constance Kauyi Fong to immigrant parents from China, Connie Mitchell grew up in the same town neighborhood where the Institute for Human Services is based, and where she leads the agency in serving the homeless and affected communities.
I grew up on Vineyard Street, and the duplex that I actually lived in isn't there anymore. They actually used it as a prop and bombed it in a tor. Yeah. But anyway, I grew up there, went to school at Ka'uala Elementary School right around the corner there. And I didn't think I would end up being so close, to where I grew up, but I am now.
Does it feel familiar?
It does, in some ways it does, and yet the neighborhood has changed, a little bit. But of course, when I was a child there's a really different context, and I might not have noticed, the things, but I'm sure there weren't as many homeless people back then as there are now.
Well, what was your life like as a child?
Well, I grew up, with an older sister and two younger brothers, and my mom and dad are actually immigrants from China. And
what part?
Guangdong. And they came separately, actually. My dad came as a teenager, and then afterward, brought my mom over.
How did he know your mom?
I asked her that question the other day, and she said, I think he knew a relative of hers, her mom's aunt or something, and so they kind of got together, and it was I always say it was a semi-arranged marriage, because I think there was, an attraction there, but she didn't know what she was coming to when she was going to come to Hawaii, right?
And they stayed together?
They did. And
4 kids?
4 kids, and so we ended up moving when I was in the 4th grade, I think, or 7th grade, up to Liliha. So that it still wasn't that far from, where I am now either, but that's where she lives still. And we grew up very, pretty Spartan lives, but I learned a lot about living simply, but never feeling like I was poor or anything, because we always had what we needed, had our imaginations, had really good friends to play with, and really, just enjoyed it. So I think, I learned a lot from, my mom and dad, but didn't really fully appreciate, I think, the experience of being an immigrant until I was much older.
What did your parents do for a living?
So my dad had a restaurant in Kapalama.
Called?
Called Namkok Chop Suey. I don't know if you remember it, but it was, a small Chinese restaurant, and my mom helped him, in the restaurant. I even worked there, in summers when I was in high school to wait on tables. And it's right where the Central Pacific Bank building is, on Dillingham now. And it was really the times that I worked was when I saw my mom and dad, because they were working all the time. And I think that's real typical a lot of times, of people who have family businesses. And I think, it was great because I could still connect with my Chinese culture, but, they weren't really there so that I explored a lot of other things and really learned a lot from friends, because my parents weren't around that much, my dad would bring dinner home, and then he would be back at the restaurant afterwards.
And you saw this as a positive thing, that you had your parents, but you also had your friends.
Yeah, and I didn't know the difference. I didn't know how other people were growing up, but that's how I grew up, and I'm just really thankful for it. I think my parents really were, I know they loved us and cared about us, and really wanted to make sure we were safe and were provided for. But when I would watch TV and you would see those TV shows about families, and I'm thinking, well, that's just not how a family is.
Well, and did you have an extended network of family at all?
We did, and it's because my dad and my mom would sponsor other relatives to come over, and my uncle on my dad's side actually worked for him as a cook also. So we did have family that came. My grandmother came when I was in the 7th grade, I think, and she was a part of our family for a short while, and then she ended up leaving and finding a place of her own. But it was really sometimes challenging because, like being bicultural, I went to Chinese school, like from 1st grade to 9th grade. So for 9 years.
Did you learn to speak Cantonese?
Yes, and my parents spoke it at home, but it was a way to really hang on to my ethnic culture, But I think all the while, it was being shaped. I also had, a lot of influence from the fact that my parents, being really open, said, why don't you go to church? And they actually, encouraged me to go, and I went to a church on Judge Street for many years, and, that helped shape my own faith, and I think.
Was it the same faith church that they believed in?
No, they weren't Christian, and I think there was a woman that went into the neighborhood and was just, looking, for children that might want to go to church. And so I started going to Sunday school and then ended up really just learning so much about God's love, and that was like a little foreign in some ways, from the culture that I was coming from. But I'm thankful for that. And I think that my faith has actually inspired a lot of the choices that I've made, throughout my life. In work particularly. And
your parents never said one thing to you about, don't go there, that's not what our Chinese family has always done?
Right, yeah. So I kind of like, was embracing the Christian faith, and then at the same time, my parents practice, their own cultural, practices and faith. So I think it's in some ways typical, of people who grow up in Hawaii. You're exposed to, a different way of thinking, and I'm thankful for the way that Hawaii is. That we are able to, no matter how we think or how we believe, that we're able to get along most of the time.
Did you feel that Honolulu was friendly to immigrants?
Yes, and I really felt like I didn't feel like I stood out or anything like that. A lot of us maybe came from the same kind of background, and I think as a child, you just know if you're playing with other people, you're playing with them, you're getting along with them, and you don't think about those other things. But that kind of childhood, growing up in a diverse community, very much shapes, how you feel when you grow up.
As a child, did you see college in your future?
I did, because my parents really valued education, so they.
And had they had a college graduate in the family yet?
No, they haven't.
So who was the first?
Well, my older sister was. She graduated from the University of Hawaii, and then I did also. She left right after college, and went to San Francisco. And my brother, who's a couple years younger than me, he did also, and they're both there now. He's an architect in San Francisco, and my sister was teaching in the Berkeley School District for many years and just recently retired.
And what did you go to college to study?
Oh, I became a nurse, and later on went back to get my master's in psychiatric and mental health nursing. And at first I wanted to be a pediatric nurse, but I couldn't deal with the pain of seeing the children, suffering so much. And I thought, okay, I don't know if I want to really do this, but I think I really have always seemed to gravitate toward serving underserved people. Like when I was in San Francisco, my first nursing job was at San Francisco General Hospital. And it was a county hospital, so you had people who were prisoners and people who were on Medicaid and, people who just didn't have that much. But it was an excellent medical center, and I learned a lot when I was there. And
Where do you think that comes from, wanting to serve the underserved?
I don't know. It's like, I'm always for the underdog, number one, but I also feel like maybe because I've been given so much and I feel so blessed that I think, for one, I think everyone, it's a basic need, a basic right, to have health care, and I really want to make sure that people are afforded that opportunity.
So you're in San Francisco getting your Master's of Science in Nursing, and how did you get back here? And I don't think it was a direct path to IHS.
No, it wasn't. So actually, I graduated here at the university in nursing, and then I went to San Francisco. I came back, and I worked actually for a doctor and managed his office, an internist, and then internal medicine practice, and then kind of saw that a lot of people who were coming in, they seemed to have a lot of mental health issues also, a lot of anxiety and stress that were causing a lot of their illnesses. So I did a stint, just really after that, going to work on a demonstration project that really addressed the connection between mind and body. So we were actually trying to demonstrate that if you provided mental health services, behavioral health services, you could actually reduce the amount of medical utilization, of a person. It's holistic medicine,
It was just common sense to you.
Yeah, really. And, I think along the way, I've also done, a little bit in financial planning, a little bit in I think I spent about 7 or 8 years serving as a pastoral associate at a church. And, all of these experiences just kind of come together in my work at IHS, because I think it's given me skills and perspectives, that are very maybe different, from somebody else who might be coming from just strictly a social work perspective.
You also saw acute mentally ill patients in residence at Hawaii State Hospital in Kaneohe.
That's correct, yeah. And so after I graduated with my master's in psych mental health nursing, my first clinical position was as a clinical nurse specialist there, and I worked with people who were dually diagnosed with cognitive impairment as well as mental illness. So they might have been developmentally disabled also. So it was just really a wonderful learning experience, there. We were under a Department of Justice consent decree and was really needing to upgrade, the quality of the care that was there.
It had to be sad to see that, the place wasn't taken care of as it should have been.
Oh yeah, I think when I first started there, it was really, and
it was dangerous for employees too, right?
It was, and at one point when I was there even, I had to take out a TRO on someone because I thought, okay, I don't know if this person's gonna kind of retaliate or anything, but we also had like a car fire that was set. And it was, very much, a retaliatory thing from, one of the patients, we believe. And it was really, the hospital was evolving at that time. It was facing the fact that it was a forensic hospital. Almost everybody that was coming in the hospital was coming in from a court order, after that. But I think, we really need to maintain a sense of the fact that these were also patients. And I think learning to triage and understand, okay, some people have some criminal tendencies that make them dangerous in a different way, and some people have more mental illness and are impaired by their mental illness. That needs to be acknowledged and recognized, because sometimes if you just say, okay, well, they're all mentally ill, and so we need to just, always take the tack that they're not responsible for their actions, then some people who are responsible for their actions don't really get the consequences that they really need.
After spending most of her career in the field of nursing and healthcare, including 14 years at the Hawaii State Hospital in Kaneohe, which included a tenure as the director of nursing, Connie Mitchell leaped into tackling homelessness in Hawaii.
Well, a friend of mine, knew that they were looking for an executive director, and I had never worked nonprofit before, but I thought
you were giving up a state. You had a stake in the state retirement
position.
system.
Yes. When I was looking for what next, for myself, I really wasn't sure, where it was going to be, And that's why I really think it was almost divine providence that, this really came about, because I heard about it through a friend of mine and I applied, but I had applied a while ago and I thought, oh, well, I guess they found somebody. So, I didn't think twice. And then I got a call back and I went for a second interview and then was offered the position, shortly after that. And I thought, well, okay, do I take a break? Because I was just moving out of, my place and had just left the hospital. And I thought, no, I think this is really what I need to do. And even when I was being interviewed, they asked me, well, how long are you gonna stay? And I said, well, I don't know. And all I can tell you is that when you give me a chance, to do something, I would give it my all. And I said, you may not like me, so we'll see how it goes, And I think that it's been a really good match for me in terms of the work.
What is your goal? Is it eliminating homelessness?
I think as a group, our Partners in Care consortium of homeless service providers and people who are concerned about homelessness, what we're trying to do is develop a system where we no longer have unsheltered homeless, and anyone who becomes homeless will quickly get into housing. So it's not about just managing homeless, like let's just put them in the shelter and leave them in the shelter. We have long left that model behind at IHS. We have been trying to house people as much as possible, and as quickly as possible. And as the system has changed and as funding has become available, we've been able to do more and more of that. I think there's very few people who just absolutely don't want help.
Is that so? They want to pick it. I mean, it seems like there are people who, if you offer them a job, they say, well, can't you just give me money? I mean, I've met a couple of those.
Yeah, I think the people on the street, people who are unsheltered, there's a really big mix. But remember, the people on the streets unsheltered are a small population compared to everyone who experiences homelessness. Once you hit the streets, a lot of people stay there for quite a while. And what we're trying to do is try to bring them in so that they don't stay there. Because once you become homeless for a long time, it's harder to get people off the street because they realize, oh, I can do this. This is fine. And they don't realize that their lives are changing, their health could be threatened, and when they do get sick, they're going to get more sick. Because we see infections that are just ridiculous.
Somehow they get accustomed and
Yes.
prefer it.
I think they lose hope. That's what it is, and they just don't think that it's possible. And if you're using drugs, you probably can't get a job. If you can't get a job, you certainly can't get a place. And if you can't get a place, then that's why you're out there on the street, right?
Hawaii has a great compassion and doesn't want to see people on the streets. It doesn't want to see people suffering. And on the other hand, there's, hey, why are we using our money well? Because aren't these people just being moved? Is anything really happening? Mm-hmm. What do you say to that?
I think that there are a lot of people that are coming off the street, and they are being tired, of the movement, of the enforcements that are going on. But I think what I envision is being able to try to convince people that they can be a part of the community again. They don't feel a part of the community. That's why they're out there. They don't have a place to go, and we have to, as a community, figure out how to do that. I believe that if every one of those people who is capable of working could work, if they weren't using drugs or their mental health was stabilized.
Those are big ifs.
Yeah, but we could do it. I believe that it can be done if we have the will to provide the services, and to walk alongside some of these people so that they can believe also. Because I don't think they believe it right now. They don't think that there is a way out. But I think if we're able to, and I've seen it happen that when they start to believe and they actually take a chance on us, they're able to get out of that situation.
The day-to-day challenges of running a large nonprofit organization and navigating the highly politicized issue of homelessness can take its toll on anyone. Connie Mitchell continues to maintain her positivity through her faith and through the inspiration of the late Father Claude Dutille, who's beloved for founding the Institute for Human Services through his peanut butter ministry of handing out sandwiches on downtown streets.
Father Dutille has always been sort of the person that I think of, in terms of his values and his approach to people.
Who started IHS, or the forerunner of IHS?
Right. He did start IHS, and he himself was someone that suffered from both mental illness and alcoholism. And he just had that kind of heart, that really wanted to give back to the community. And I think that, it's a person like that who galvanized the community to want to do something that is my inspiration in a lot of ways. And on the other hand, I feel like the hard part comes from that. I think, my husband Mark is someone that has really taught me a lot about systems and how to be willing, to kind of change things, so that things can be better. And my husband's just awesome. He really understands because he was in the mental health field as well. Or I shouldn't say was, he still is.
Okay, now how did he come into your life?
Well, we met at a conference, and then later on, he was, doing some consultation. And I actually, when he ended up coming over to Hawaii, he was the CEO at Kahimohala, for a number of years, and then he retired again, and then he ended up not retiring and going back to work for the state at the Department of Public Safety. So, he's very well versed in systems issues, with mental health, with developmental disabilities, with health in general, and so we had a lot in common, and really. I look to him for a lot of wisdom sometimes, about how to proceed, but he also has a lot of experience that he is able to share with me that I've learned a lot from, I think. So emotionally, intellectually, I'm really grateful for a lot of the friends that I have had. I've had, a good friend of mine, her brother had committed suicide, and this was when I was in college and nursing school, and I just thought, wow, that impacted me. And then I had another friend who committed suicide later on, who was in my Bible study group. And mental health seemed to be a theme in my life.
As of this conversation in June of 2017, Connie Mitchell has grown the Institute for Human Services from its original 2 shelters in Iwilei to 8 facilities, including locations in Sand Island and Kalihi Valley. A believer in servant leadership, Mitchell remains passionate about the job overseeing 150 employees.
So one of your staffers, Kimo Carvalho, says he really likes working with you because, of course, you're serious, but you're also silly. What does that mean?
I can be pretty silly in terms of, when we get together and we do like little office parties and stuff like that. I will sometimes surprise people by, what I would dress up at Halloween or something like that, But, it's like, I'm just like anybody else, and I've, always felt like being a leader doesn't mean you put yourself above. It really means that you're willing to do whatever anybody else is doing and you're working alongside them,
So servant leadership?
Yeah, it's got to be about that. I think it's really trying to bring out the best in other people, and really helping them to really blossom and find their voice and, find their strengths.
You have so many constituencies. How do you spend your time?
Well,
you've got to talk to lawmakers, you've
absolutely.
got to talk to funders, you've got to talk to homeless people and supervisors and community leaders and business owners.
So there's no usual day at IHS. Everything is urgent, and you're right. We really look at the community as a major stakeholder. We serve not only the people who are homeless, but we serve our community. And as a part of that community, we have, people who are policymakers. We have people who are funders. People who are just the public. We really want to help people understand better what homelessness is about in Hawaii, and we want them to understand how we all can help them better.
I think it's so wonderful that after, is it 11 years on the job now? 11 years on the job, you're very positive, you continue to work at a very high performance rate. And what keeps you going?
That's a good question. I think it's really seeing people turn their lives around when we are able to help them. And it happens quite often, I have to tell you. So I think just being able to do some new things, find some new solutions, partner with new people, who have similar passion and, just really want to make a difference. That's really exciting to me to see so many people like that.
Connie Mitchell, Executive Director of the Institute for Human Services, is a hard worker and a respected leader. And Hawaii still has a high homeless population per capita. She says we're making headway in slowing down the rate at which homelessness grows. And she says that if different parts of our government would just agree to work together at important junctures, such as when inmates are released from prison, we could do better. Mahalo to Connie Mitchell of Honolulu for sharing your story with us. And thank you for joining us. For PBS Hawaii and Long Story Short, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Aloha hui hou.
For audio and written transcripts of all episodes of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, visit pbshawaii.org. To download free podcasts of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, go to the Apple iTunes Store or visit pbshawaii.org.
When I go home at night, I'm pretty pooped usually, but the weekends I really try to get out into the garden. I love gardening. I love growing things, partly because I think you can see, difference faster. Things grow in 1 week, you know what I mean?